So my presentation, I'm just going to take you guys through quickly a couple of assignments and some personal work that I've done in the past decade. That makes me feel really old. I'm not the best person really to talk about balancing assignment and personal work. It's really a difficult thing to do. Most people end up being kind of assignment photographers or project photographers because it's kind of easier to work that way. But I think it's really important to balance the two, and when you do, they can complement each other. So I'll quickly go through some stuff I've done in the past. So I started traveling, I guess, about a decade ago when the war started in Iraq. And I was a newspaper photographer for the Washington Post. And I was sent there, this is the first war I've ever covered, very green. And I covered kind of the daily work, the daily grind, which was, you know, the military, the violence, embedded quite a bit. There were IEDs. It was really intense. We would wake up every morning for a couple of years. I actually covered Iraq for about 7 years, and for on and off. And it just became this constant struggle to tell the story of the military as well as tell the story of Iraqis, because after a while it felt like the U.S. And all the people who live there, who are mainly my audience for the Washington Post, they just couldn't relate after a while, and they kind of turned off to anything dealing with Iraq. So I decided to try a different approach. So while covering the bang bang and the violence that was happening in Iraq, I also decided to cover daily life, because I decided that until people could relate to other people in a different culture, with a different religion, with a different language, they wouldn't really care what's happening to them. So I wrote a column, and one photo ran very large inside the Washington Post, and I thought, things like a Monday morning commute, what could people in Washington, D.C. relate to more? But the difference is this man is surrounded by blast walls, trash with an infrastructure that totally melted and wore down after the war started, and wild dogs. I wanted people to see the daily life, see people in their homes, normal schools. This is exam day. This is a family who was homeless, praying. Fishermen who no longer had fish on the Tigris River. They became taxis for people to kind of get through, because the city was so packed with roadblocks, checkpoints, military destruction, that the fishing boats became one of the main ways to get across the river. And dust storms. And while I was doing that daily work, I also had to find ways to kind of replenish myself, find ways to be able to wake up every morning and cover the bombings and even the daily life. And there was one thing that I became annoyed by in the coverage, and that's the way people covered women. And so people would often use women as kind of a graphic element in a frame. So you'd see a headscarf, or an abaya, kind of ghostly walking across the frame. And that really bothered me, because the people underneath those abayas are women with a personality. And so I decided to do a portrait series that, when you see all these women one after the other, you see their faces more than you see the abaya that they wear. These are the daughters of Iraq. They're widows who are hired to search other women at checkpoints. The stripe was something the US military put on them so that they knew who they are. Another personal project that I did, and this was, these are projects that the Washington Post eventually did run, kind of begrudgingly, but they were stories that kept me going. Hala is a prostitute who became one of my closest friends for a year, the first year of the war. Prostitution is a normal part of war all over the world. And it took me probably, I don't know, a month of interviewing 30 different women before I found one who didn't ask for money and who really understood why I was doing the project and wasn't scared. She was very brave. She wanted to tell her story. Her husband died in the initial bombing of 2003, and she became a prostitute to take care of her children. And this is why she does what she does. So I think it's really the projects that I did, and those are just a couple while I was in Iraq, that allowed me to become a freelancer afterwards. People knew me by that work more than they knew me from the daily work that I was doing. And so I went freelance, and I started covering Afghanistan. I moved there. Sorry, let me get some water. Sorry. Thank you. So in Afghanistan, I actually received a grant, which is, I think, the way most people start to do project work. And I started covering the camps outside of Kabul as one of the sections of this grant. So I started doing some medium format work of the camps itself. And then I got an assignment from the New York Times to also cover Afghanistan, and we would cover it in 1 month blocks or a month and a half blocks. So I live in Afghanistan for the New York Times on assignment. And one year, the government, or there were these reports that people in the camps were, children in the camps were dying because of the cold. I think there are around 22,000 people living in these camps surrounding Kabul, homeless because of the violence mostly. And at first the children thought the snow was really beautiful. Most of them are from an area of Afghanistan that doesn't see snow. These are girls who are, there's an NGO that was giving out flour, and these girls were picking the flour out of the snow. A bag had broken. And because of the work that I had done previously on those assignments, not the assignments, but my personal projects, I had access to the camp that I think very few had. I was welcomed to the funerals and allowed inside people's homes, which is where I took the pictures of people who are the children who are actually dying. And this brings me to Guatemala. This is a region that I normally don't cover. So for me, to be in Guatemala is very rare. And MSF, Doctors Without Borders, were the ones who hired me to come to La Ciudad. I was only coming for 2 weeks, and this is something that often happens with assignment photographers is you're dropped in the middle of nowhere and you're expected to come back with a story. MSF wanted me to do a very reporter-like story. They wanted it to be documentary. They didn't want their own workers in it. They just wanted to show sexual violence or the violence of the city in general and how it affects everyday people. And when I dive into a city that I don't know very well and I'm photographing the violence, I think, oh, how am I going to meet people? What am I going to do? So I camped out at the cemetery first for a couple of days. And walking through the streets, I noticed that everyone kind of lives behind bars or behind closed doors in neighborhoods, which is something I wasn't really used to. The Middle East seems like a pretty open place. And I'm not sure, I imagine this woman is a prostitute, but still the tension between men and women was clear. This is a 13-year-old girl who was kidnapped and raped repeatedly for a week. And she had a baby. And the kind of endless slums. And the bomberos, who are my personal heroes, they have very little equipment and dive into the city. And this was another way for me to get a different and personal and active view of the city. At the time I was there, and I don't know if this is still happening, but a lot of gangs were initiating young children, and in order to be initiated, you had to kill someone younger than you. So a lot of small children were being shot, and this small child died by an 11-year-old. Again, the bomberos diving into a fire with little gear. And this, to me, kind of summed up this urban survivor mindset. This girl juggling oranges at a stoplight, surrounded by the craziness of the city. And this leads me to Syria, which is something I did last year. It was also an assignment work. One was some of it was for National Geographic, some of it was for the New York Times. But assignment work is also a lot of personal persistence. I waited for probably 6 months or longer to get a visa. And then I was told I had a visa, and I went to Beirut, and I went to the embassy, and they said, tomorrow. And the next day, I went to the embassy, and they said, tomorrow. And I had people like National Geographic going, hey, why aren't you in Syria? I thought it was a go. And still, tomorrow, for 2 weeks straight, every day. And so I finally told National Geographic, this isn't going to work out. I don't think they're going to give it to me. And so they flew me back home. And I was like, oh man, my one chance at National Geographic, and I just blew it, but it wasn't my fault. They don't know that. I just, applied and was persistent, and they told me I had it, but I didn't. And then they called the Syrian embassy and said, no, really, this time you have it. So I had to call up National Geographic and say, they say I have it. I don't really know, but do you want to take a chance? And luckily they did. And then once you get in Damascus, which is the regime side of the Syrian story, it was, well, not the regime side, just the people living under the regime, I guess I should say. You deal with a difficult thing because it's people living under war, but generally it looks normal. Businesses are open, cafes are full, schools are operational, bread lines are longer, but they still exist. And all of the kind of stuff that you guys are doing here, I had to do every day. I did a story, on a different person almost every day. And even getting into a school took me 2 weeks of getting approvals, checking with people. And probably the hardest part of working in Syria under the regime is that I had minders. There are people who wouldn't let me out of my hotel without their presence. So I'd say, please wake up before dawn. I'm working for National Geographic. I have to get the sunrise and the sunset. And they'd say, sure, no problem. And I'd wait in the lobby from 5 a.m. until 11 a.m. every day. And I couldn't leave without them. And there was some violence, but I've seen enough suicide bombings in my life not to want to cover them as suicide bombings. I wanted to cover the people who live on the edges. This woman is still living in this building. And also the military. Regardless of your politics, people die on every side of a war. This is a funeral procession for a military captain. And this is his brother, who looked inside the casket and had this very gut, normal reaction that you see all the time in war, which is revenge. He saw his brother dead in the casket and automatically started screaming, waving his gun, and darting out the door. People had to stop him. And this is him with his mother. And that's it. Actually, I just wanted to give you guys a quick overview of different aspects. If you guys have any questions.